Our guest is, I think it's fair to call him a living legend, and it is not only because he has lived this long and he is beginning his second century, where most of us are still in our first, and not only that he worked with all of the formidable geniuses of cinema of the last century, including Orson Welles and Renoir and Charlie Chaplin and so on and so forth. I think it's because his own career, standing by itself as an actor, as a director, a producer, in films, in television, and most especially in theater, is just completely stands by itself. So it's with great pleasure today that I welcome back to the Camelot stage after the screening another visit from the incomparable Mr. Norman Lloyd, who is with us today. You know, when I saw you with that police uniform on and telling the guy in the Bradbury building, "Come on, open up," I said, gee, Norman is really from Jersey City. There was a little of that New Jersey you brought back to that.
I'm glad I never lost all of it. But you know, we started out in Jersey City, and we got into Manhattan, and gradually we started with Eva Leggett in 1932. And one day she said to me, who talked Jersey, "Lloyd, if you want to be a member of my company, you'd better learn to speak properly." Since she was doing Shakespeare, Ibsen, Chekhov, etc., I thought I'd better mend my ways. But I never lost a tinge of Jersey.
Now you, Joe Losey and you went way back, well before this movie. Talk about Joe Losey, the director, because I think a lot of people, when I was a kid and I watched The Servant, I thought, oh, Joe Losey, he's an English director. Not so. Let us know about your experience with Joe Losey and working with him in the theater.
Yes, I first met Losey in 1934. There was a play that the Harvard Dramatic Club was doing called A Bride for the Unicorn by Dennis Johnston, who everyone thought was the successor to Sean O'Casey. And Joe was directing this play. He had not gone to Harvard, he had gone to Dartmouth. But the Harvard Dramatic Club found that they didn't have the personnel to do this play that they had selected. So Joe was directing, and I was there with a company that had formed out of Eva Leggett theater. I was playing in Boston, and Joe saw me in this play and asked me if I would be in this play for the Harvard Dramatic Club. Well, I thought, this is the nearest I'll ever get to going to Harvard. So I said yes. And we did it. And it was the beginning of 4 theater productions that I did with Losey, the most important of which was the creation and development of the living newspaper, which some critics have thought was one of the most important theaters since the Greeks. Now, I know that's pretentious, and maybe we should have stayed with the Greeks. But anyway, I always grabbed a good notice where I could. But the living newspaper was this fantastic development of the Federal Theater, which was a development of the Work Progress Administration under President Roosevelt. And theater was developed all over the country. We were in New York, and the living newspaper was directed by Losey And then he disappeared until he turned up in Europe doing The Stranger.
Right, right. How was he as a director compared to, say, yourself or Orson? Was he good with actors, good with staging? What were his attributes?
I should never tell these stories.
Yes, you should.
Joe was a very good guy. I liked Joe. He was a good friend. But Joe had a mannerism as a director. As he would work with the actors, he was very skillful at staging. He had, incidentally, in 1935 or 6, had gone to Moscow, where he worked and studied the Vakhtangov theater, which was the opposite of the Stanislavski method. It's a much more expressionistic theater. But Joe, with all his knowledge about staging, which was vast, and a good guy, he had contained within himself some curious thing, so that whenever he directed actors, which meant directing human beings instead of scenery, he would sigh. He would say, "Alan, perhaps you ought to go over there, stage right." Alan, a little farther over, please. Oh,
Inspirational.
So the company knew that I was a close friend of Joe's. I was. He actually gave my wife and I a honeymoon. He was then the partner of Elizabeth Hawes, who was one of the premier dress designers in America. And he gave Peggy and myself, he invited us up to Vermont, where she had an estate, and so he was a great friend. So members of the company at various times came to me and said, "Listen, you're close to Joe. Why does he always sigh when he directs me?" I said, "Nothing, it's not you personally, don't take it personally, he just sighs." And I thus rescued the production.
Now, I think you mentioned to me at one time that Losey and Orson were kind of contemporaries in the theater, and they were a little bit competitive with one another, or they were viewed that way. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know about the one another, but your point is well taken. This was the 30s, the depths of the Depression, a period in which wonderful theater was happening in America. Wonderful developments. The Federal Theater, the Group Theater, the Theater Guild, etc. I could go on, Theater Union and so on. But the one director, young director who emerged in this period was Orson Welles, particularly with a production known as the Black Macbeth. Although it was also on Orson's project, they did The Cradle of Rock. Fantastic work was being done by Orson, and we were doing pretty well with the living newspaper. But as young directors emerged, there were others, but Losey and Welles, but particularly Welles, seemed to be coming to the foreground. And while I don't ever recall them meeting each other, but it was clear in the end that Orson reigned supreme. And Joe, he did a couple of good pictures, The Prowler,
Yeah.
but he made his name actually when he went to Europe
Right.
and started with The Stranger, wasn't it?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he never really fulfilled himself in America, but he did in Europe because he became very well known, particularly working on the plays of Harold Pinter.
Yes.
And it was with his collaboration with Pinter that he achieved eminence.
Now, did you work with him on the Brecht production of Galileo, which was well after the Federal Theater period?
Well, the Galileo was before he went to Europe.
Right, early 50s.
Yeah. John Houseman and I had taken a theater in Los Angeles, the Coronet, on La Cienega Boulevard. And as one of the plays we were going to do was the world premiere of a play called Galileo, starring Charles Laughton. I came upon this play because everyone had turned it down, and everyone of so-called eminence, including Orson, Kazan, Harold Klorman, Mike Todd, and so on. All eminent directors had turned it down. I happen to know Hans Eisler, who was a composer of eminence, and he was a friend of Bertolt Brecht. Brecht was a major figure in the history of the theater. He changed writing, he changed playwriting, and the kind of play you saw on a stage. Through Eisler, I got to know Brecht and found out that Galileo was lying there, so to speak. Brecht had been working on it, the translation, with Charles Laughton for 2 years. Laughton was fascinating and wanted to play this part of Galileo. So Eisler had me contact Brecht, and I got the play. We were going to do it in the Coronet with Laughton, the major influence on it. And one day Joe was looking for a project to do, and he brought me a play based on a short story called Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, which originally was published as a magazine story.
Yeah, to realize.
It later became a big hit picture called Seven Brides for Seven Brothers.
Yeah. MGM.
How amazing they kept the title. That's why I couldn't remember it. Joe brought the story to me. I was then working for Louis Milestone, and who I'm sure you all know is an eminent producer, director. All Quiet on the Western Front, of Mice and Men, and so on. And I was working with him as his associate. And Joe, out of old friendship, brought this piece to me and said, would Milestone be interested in doing it? And I read it, and I said, it's great, but it's not Milestone. He won't go for it. But Joe, you stage managed a Charles Laughton play called The Fatal Alibi that ran for 2 weeks. Why don't you go to Charles and get the job of directing this play? Which he did. And Laughton and Brecht, he knew Brecht, agreed that he should direct the play, and that's the way it happened.